So what happens at Thessalonica? They get to Thessalonica. As his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue. This is Acts chapter 17, verse 5. On three Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. And God-fearing Greeks and prominent women believe. When the God-fearing women believe and prominent women, God-fearing Greeks believe, the Jews become jealous. And what happens is they assault the house of Jason where Paul is staying. Paul is staying at this house of Jason, and basically the Jews then form a crowd. They come to assault the house of Jason. Paul basically beats it out the back door and escapes. So at Thessalonica, it's pretty modern Thessaloniki, but today they assault the house of Jason. Paul skedaddles, gets out of there, and beats it by fleeing and things, okay? And they're saying, their accusation was that he was saying there's another King Jesus instead of Caesar. And so they're going after Paul on that basis. Now, when they get to Berea is a special place. Many of you have heard of Berean Bible chapels and things like that. The Bereans were basically, Berea is just down the road from Thessalonica. These are the three cities in Macedonia up north, in Greece and things. And it says, now the Bereans were more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness. And then this is what the Bereans are known for, okay? When you say Berean Bible Chapel, a lot of Berean Bible studies and things like that, they examine the Scripture every day to see if what Paul said was true. So the Bereans pride themselves in that they examine the Scriptures to see whether things are true. And that's a noble thing. They were more noble than the people at Thessalonica who beat up on Jason's house and that kind of thing. So Paul then leaves, actually, Silas and Timothy there. And then Paul heads down, leaving Silas and Timothy there. Paul heads down here to Athens. Athens is located right here, so Paul heads down from Macedonia down to Athens. Athens is, the most famous Greek city. This is where Paul then at Mars Hill speaks to the philosophers on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. And let me just read some of this. Acts chapter 17, verse 16. All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Athens, the great home of Socrates. Athens, the great place of Plato, Aristotle, the great thinkers, of great philosophers and things like that, Athens. Paul then goes and he says, as I walked about, I looked carefully at your objects of worship, and I found an altar with the inscription, to the unknown God. Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. God made the world. God made the world is served not by human hands making idols. Okay? In Him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are His offspring. This in Him we live and move and have our being, he's quoting, I believe it's from Aratus here, one of the Greek poets. Okay? One of the Greek poets. We are His offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like silver, gold, or stone. Okay? And he's quoting Epimenides in this kind of, in those contexts as well. Okay? So the question is, what is Paul doing here? And then this is the big question that Tertullius asked. What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? And then this tension between Jerusalem, that is a place of religion, and Athens, the place of philosophy and things. It turns out that Paul seems to have interacted with Greek culture enough that he takes, for example, the statue to the unknown God, and he says, I'm going to declare it to you now. He uses what's in their culture to proclaim Christ to them, using things that they're familiar with. And so he quotes from Aratus, he quotes from Epimenides, he quotes from these Greek writers, because they're familiar with that. And Paul's a very, very smart man, and he picks up on this stuff, and then he uses it as a place of connection, a nexus between his Christ that he's going to preach and their culture. And so this is the suggestion is then is it important for a Christian to be very aware of the culture in which we live? And is it important as a Christian to be aware of the culture and to be able to use the things in our culture to proclaim Christ? Should we know philosophy? Should we know philosophy? Should we know the philosophy of our day in order to proclaim Christ? And the answer is yes. And that's what a place like Gordon College is all about, liberal arts, where we seriously study philosophy. We've got some phenomenal philosophers here. And basically they teach philosophy and you're learning philosophy and learning what is the culture saying and what are the major influences that undergird and underpin this philosophy. What is the basic philosophies of our age and how do you interact with them as a Christian? Some of the philosophies, even as Paul said, some of the things they say are true. Is it possible for an unregenerate, non-Christian person to say some true things? Of course it is. And so you study philosophy and you sort out what things are true, what things are not true. And you basically, what are the things that are really hindering our culture's understanding of Christ? And at what points can we attack and make argumentations on that? You study philosophy. Do you study history? History, again, in order to understand our culture and proclaim Christ, you need to understand history. Do you need to understand? We've got English classes here. You've got communications classes. Do we need to express the gospel in these new mediums? That is, the digital medium. And that's one of the things I really argue strongly for, that we as Christians need to understand this digital medium that is so important in our culture in terms of our listening with buds in our ears and watching on television screens, on pads, on phones, on PCs and laptops and all sorts of things. Whatever it is, we basically are taking this digital medium and we as Christians need to understand how do you communicate in this new medium. And so communications, we use music here, art, and all sorts of forms that we understand and we work with. And that's the basis for Christian education is basically, if you have to put it in one sentence, I guess Arthur Holmes probably did the best job. The guy was totally credible with this. All truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth. And so we do sciences, we do biology, we do chemistry, we do physics, not as people who are afraid of those disciplines and that they're going to affect their religion, but no, God is the author of science and things. So yes, I want to understand science as a Christian from a biological, from a chemical, from a physics kind of perspective, and even mathematics, the language of the universe, to understand that and get a handle on how the cosmos is actually and how things are ordered and how we can construct things mathematically. It's just incredible. So anyways, that's what we're basically for the liberal arts education for. And Paul then, at Athens, he speaks to the philosophers very fluently in their language. He speaks in their language, the language of these idols that they were worshiping, and in the language of their poets and in their philosophers. And so we also need to be very aware of our culture, and that's kind of the basis for one of the bases. People on this campus could argue it much better than I can, but one of the bases for a substantial embrace of the liberal arts. Paul at Athens. What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? Everything. Okay? From Athens, then, Paul goes to Corinth. And this is, we've taken a little bit too long on some of these others, but Corinth is where Paul stays for a year and a half. On the second missionary journey, this is where Paul settles down, at Corinth. Okay? So second missionary journey, he starts at Antioch, goes through, all the cities, Antioch, Lystra and things, picks up Timothy, goes up to Troas, picks up Luke, goes over to Macedonia, Philippi, Philippian jailer, Thessalonica, Jason's house, Berea, they study the scriptures. He comes down to Athens, does the thing there, hits Corinth. When he hits Corinth, he stays there for a year and a half. So second missionary journey, almost 2 years at Corinth, okay? Now, when he's at Corinth, we're in Acts chapter 18 now. In Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and following, it says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy." Now, why had Aquila come from Italy? And his wife's name was Priscilla. So this is where you have Aquila and Priscilla. Okay, Aquila's the man, Priscilla's the wife. And because Claudius is, I think it was around 49, I'm not sure of the exact date, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So here you get this anti-Semitism stuff, even in Claudius, the emperor, ordering them to leave Rome. And so Priscilla and Aquila left Rome, which would be over here, and came to Corinth. Again, we remember how the connection between Rome and Corinth, we said the sailors sailing, rather than sailing all around this Peloponnese here, they sail in here, in this nice harbor here, and then they unload and cross this 7-mile isthmus here from one side to the next, and then they go over to Ephesus and things. So you save yourself all this traveling around this rocky shoreline and bad shoreline here, and just go in here, unload, reload, and then come across. So Priscilla and Aquila, he meets them there, and then we should say, what does he do? He makes tents. Actually, Priscilla and Aquila apparently makes tents. This is where Paul makes tents. Many Christian people, they say they're tent makers. And what does that mean? That means like a guy is, for example, in Afghanistan. Do you remember there was a missionary there who was actually killed dead? This is a real shame. But was a missionary for, I think it was 28 years in Afghanistan. He was an ophthalmologist. In other words, he helped the Afghani people with their sight. And he was an ophthalmologist in Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban got a hold of him and butchered him, killed him, and things. And that was just, I think it was a couple of years ago. And what happened was he was in Afghanistan doing what? Well, yeah, he was a missionary of sorts, but he actually was a tent maker. He actually worked providing them with services with ophthalmology and things like that. I had some student friends and things from former college I worked at, Grace, that went to Germany. And I think one of them was an architect, one of them was an engineer, and I'm not sure what the third one was. But these three guys got together and they said, hey, let's become missionaries to Germany. And so what they did was they used their architect, he was an architect, he used his architectural stuff to actually work a job in Germany. And the other guy was an engineer, and he worked as an engineer in Germany. And he's probably, designing Mercedes-Benz or something. But anyway, he's worked as an engineer there. And then what would happen is they would get involved with the churches and help with the churches in Germany and things. So that's called tent making. And it's built off this passage in Corinth that Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila, they made tents. And that's what they did. So Paul, I kind of like that, actually. The Jewish way of education. In America, we educate, in schools and this kind of stuff. The Jewish people educate their kids in Torah, but they also give their kids a skill. They also give their kids a skill. And so Jesus, for example, Jesus was called the what? The son of the carpenter. But if you go into some of the passages, I think it's in Mark, it says Jesus himself was a carpenter. And so what happened is the father would have a trade, and the kid would actually learn the trade, actually a trade off his father. Now he would also learn Torah and the ways to think, but they would also learn a skill. And so I think in life it's pretty important, I think, to get both of those. I know when I was going through high school and stuff, the vocational stuff was put down as being non-academic and beneath us and things, and then you find out you can't get a job. And so it's good to have some just down-to-earth, pragmatic skills. And the Jewish people trained people both in terms of their mind and also their hands and skills and stuff. And so Paul was a tent maker. Paul was a rabbi, trained under Gamaliel. The guy's really bright, but he also knew how to make tents. And so that's what he does. And he supports himself at Corinth, which is interesting. This is going to come up later in 2 Corinthians. He says, I didn't let you guys support me. I didn't let you guys. Corinth was known for its wealth. He said, I wouldn't take any of your wealth because I don't want that to hinder my ministry here by you guys saying, well, you just came here to get money. No. I made tents and supported myself when I was here. So Paul was very independent. You get this Paul was not an entitled missionary. Like I come in and I'm a missionary and you guys got to all support me because I'm the big Bologna missionary and things. No. Paul worked with his hands, supported himself, and took care of business. So that's at Corinth. Priscilla and Aquila, his ministry there with them. And that's a pretty, and he spends 1.5 years there at Corinth. So the church at Corinth is going to be a big deal. Now, when he's at Corinth, Timothy and Silas come down from Thessalonica. And so what happens is Paul then writes the Thessalonians, second missionary journey from Corinth. He's going to be there for 1 year. And he writes back 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and up to the Thessalonian people. So you've got this kind of thing going on with Paul writing back to the Thessalonians from Corinth and things. Another thing we should say at this point, too, why did Paul stay in Corinth for so long? Usually in other cities, Paul got beat up and had to flee for his life. Well, here's what happens at Corinth. He goes into the synagogue and preaches in there, and Crispus, the synagogue leader, becomes a Christian. The synagogue leader becomes a Christian. Sosthenes, who wasn't the synagogue leader, but another guy, comes and starts making trouble for Paul. So he hauls Paul's tail in front of Gallio. Gallio is the governor, big governor type person. And so Sosthenes has Paul dragged in before a Gentile court. But when Gallio, the governor, sees this, he says, these are a bunch of squabbling Jews. I don't want to get involved with this. I don't know what to do. And so he throws them out of court. He dismisses the charges. So this guy comes with charges against Paul. The Gallio, the governor, throws him out of court and says, get out of here. This is garbage. I don't want to deal with this. And throws him out. What happens to Sosthenes, rather than Paul getting beat up, Sosthenes gets beat up. So Paul is off the hook. The other guy got beat up that time. So Paul says, hey, I like this place. We're going to stay here for a while. And so Paul stays there for a year and a half. And he writes Thessalonians from there. So that's kind of the background for some of that stuff. And then Paul, so then he stays at Corinth a year and a half. Priscilla and Aquila. There's another guy named Apollos who's important later on. Apollos was a man mighty in Scripture. He understood the Old Testament Scriptures really well. Becomes a Christian, and then he becomes a major force at Corinth. Paul, knows of him and links up with him. Priscilla and Aquila, Apollos and stuff. And then Paul does wee all the way home from Corinth. He leaves and goes back. And he goes back to Israel and things. Okay, so that's the second missionary journey. When does the second missionary journey take place? You don't have to know the date. All the date you got to know is what? Jerusalem Council, 50 AD. First missionary journey, right before that, 48, 49, right before it. Second missionary journey, 50 AD, right after it, 51, 52, right after. Okay, so first missionary journey, Jerusalem Council. Second missionary journey. And second missionary journey largely at Corinth for 2 years. Although he gets there through Lystra, Troas, Philippi, and these various places, picking up Luke and Timothy, as we said before. Now, we want to move to the third missionary journey, and you'll be happy to know there are only 3 missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. Okay, so